Episode 4 and 2. I have no idea what I'm gonna do. Of course, eventually. Okay. If I was gonna figure out what to do, of course. If I assume. Yep. Because I have no idea what I'm gonna do, but Hinges has a good point, by the way. Of course. Eventually. What I'm gonna do? Oh, right. I have no idea. Of course. So, what's up this time? I don't know. Because you have a good point? Yep, because I said so. Right. Did I realize that? Of course. Because you have no idea. I know. For some reasons, if you assume, yep. Because I didn't know this visually. Of course. Because you have no idea, right? Well, it might be, by the way. But if you assume visually, of course. Guess I got a good point. If you assume. And it might be. Eventually. Of course. You have no idea. I know. So what I'm gonna figure this out visually? Well, it might be, by the way. If you assume. Of course. I know, right? If you assume. Yep, eventually. Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? If you assume visually. Of course. For some reasons, right? Yep. If you assume. Of course. Yep, no, yeah. I know. For some reasons, eventually. If I assume, right? Of course. I know. For some reasons, eventually. You have no idea. I know. For some reasons, right? Yep. If I assume, eventually. Until you know this. If you assume. Because you have no idea, right? Yep. Because you said so. I know, right? If you assume, Julie. Of course. I know, right? If you assume, Julie. Of course. I know, right? If you assume. Yep. Because you said so. I know. For some reasons. Eventually. If you assume. Yep. Okay. So, how do you know that? Well, it might be, of course. Because I figured this out from earlier. Right, did I realize that? Yep, if I guess individually. Until you do this, definitely. It just has a good point, isn't? Well, it might be, but you have no idea. I know. For some reasons, if you assume. Yep, because you have no idea. I know, eh? If you assume visually, of course. I know. For some reasons, if you assume. Yep. Okay. Did I realize that? Yep. Of course. I know, right? Did I realize that? Yep. Eventually. So, did I realize that? Yep, because you have no idea. Of course. So, at least you're trying to visually. Well, it might be, by the way. You have no idea. I know, right? If you assume, yep, because you have no idea. Of course. You have no idea, right? Yep. If you assume, usually, until you know this. I know, right? If you can assume usually. Of course, because you have no idea. I know, right? If you can assume. Yep. For some reasons, right? Of course. I know, right? If you can assume usually. Yep, because you have no idea. I know, right? If you can assume usually. Until you notice definitely. He just has a good point, isn't? Well, if you can essentially. Yep. Because I said so. Right. Did I realize that? Yep, because you have no idea. Of course. So what's gonna be? I know. Just has a good point, isn't? By the way. Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? If you consume. Yep, because you have no idea. I know, why? If you consume Italy, of course. I know, why? If you consume Italy, yep, of course. You have no idea, right? Well, if you consume Italy, of course. You have no idea, right? Yep. If you consume Italy, of course. So, if you consume, yep, because you have no idea. Of course. For some reasons, if you consume, yep, because you have no idea. Of course. I know, why? If you consume Italy, of course. I know, why? If you consume, yep, because you have no idea. For some reasons. If you consume, by the way. Of course, you have no idea. I know, why? If you consume Italy. It just has a good point, by the way. So, did I realize that, by the way? Of course. Because you have no idea. For some reasons, if you consume. Yep. Because you have no idea. For some reasons, right? Yep, if you consume easily. By the way. If you consume easily. Of course, you have no idea. I know, eh? If you consume easily. Of course. I know, eh? Did I realize that? Yep, because you have no idea. I know. For some reason, usually, if you consume, I guess. Of course. I know, eh? If you consume, usually. Yep. Because you have no idea. I know, eh? If you consume. Yep, because I was literally young at the point. Of course. For some reasons, right? Yep, if you consume. Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? If you consume chili. Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? If you consume chili. Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? If you consume chili. Of course. I know, right? If I consume chili. That's a good point, by the way. cause I have no idea. I know, right? If you can see me, Julie? Yep, cause I have no idea. Of course. For some reasons, right? Well, if you can assume. Yep. Cause you have no idea, by the way. Of course. I know, right? If you can assume, Julie? Of course. For some reasons, right? Yep, because you have no idea. I know, right? If you can assume, Julie? Of course. Because you have no idea, right? Yep. Because you have no idea. And because I said so, and you need a. Didn't know I realized that? Yep, because I said so. And you have no idea. Of course. For some reasons, but I have no idea. Well, it might be, but you can assume. Yep. Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? If you can assume. Of course, you have no idea, right? Yep. If you can assume, Julie. Of course. I know, right? So, if you can assume. Yep. Because I said so. Right. Did I realize that?